First item on our agenda is the increase, the same item that's been on here since last November, which is about our committee considering the increase in the number of ground EMS providers in metropolitan areas and to make suggestions to GCHAC on rule changes. So a number of you came to our meeting in Dallas back in October, and at that meeting we discussed a number of items that had been submitted to DSHS from the Texas Ambulance Association as several strategies, as they called them, in an effort to help combat fraud. And we spent 5+ hours going over those 8 suggestions and spent the majority of our time on the administrator of record suggestion, which if you've seen that letter, I think it's been out there under documents for meetings for a couple of meetings for us, but if you've seen that, the first item was an administrator of record. It was basically providing more accountability on the administrator of record for the agency that we're currently already required to provide, and to do a number of other things on that. So the committee went through that, and what I'd like to do is, not everybody here was able to make that meeting. I think everybody's seen the minutes. There's a number of you in the audience that was at that meeting in October in Dallas. And a lot of the things that we are proposing or that we are putting together in this proposal to GTAC are going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a big change and potentially could be controversial. And so we want to read through what we accomplished in Dallas and then open it up to the committee and then open it up to the floor to spend a little bit of time talking about these things. So Indra's going to go through on the screen. I know it's kind of tough to see, but I'm going to, oh, look at that, we got them real big too, cool. So the first thing was that the person named as administrator must have personal accountability for the actions of the agency. And so when we sit to craft rule language, or when DSHS sits to craft rule language, what we want to do is that as the administrator, much like a course coordinator, the person who is an administrator, and in a minute we're going to get to what that means, but the person who is an administrator will have accountability, so they could lose their ability to be an administrator for EMS agencies if they mess things up. Remember this, although this would apply to all EMS transport providers, this is aimed at those that are coming into the market later, or those that are in the market for a reason that is maybe not to provide care and transportation to the sick and injured. So we felt that in the rule that there must be some personal accountability placed upon the administrator, just like there is upon course coordinator. So that could be suspension, revocation of the ability to be an administrator, that kind of thing. The next bullet point we came to is each organization must have an administrator. No one can be named the administrator for more than one paid agency at a time. If there's a need, and this came up from some on the committee, if there's a need for someone to administrate more than one paid agency, they could seek a variance from DSHS, which would be given based upon the needs, location, and service type. So one of the committee members, I think it was Lon, was currently acting as an administrator for a second agency that had lost its administrator. And we don't want to preclude that from being done in the right circumstances. What we're trying to do is preclude the folks that have multiple provider licenses or multiple packages ready for multiple provider licenses sitting on the shelf ready to go, so if they get in trouble with one and get shut down, they immediately can refile. And so, or they immediately just go to another provider license and it's the same administrator. So the goal is to say for a paid agency with a purpose for a variance in a public safety need, so maybe up in the Panhandle, I told Justin I'd say this, maybe up in the Panhandle where the Piggly Wiggly manager is also the EMS director, that he could be that for more than one agency if need be, even though they're paid agencies. And part of that has to do with the depth of what it takes to qualify as a volunteer agency, and some of that has to do with just the needs of the area. Maybe that's the only person that has the qualifications really to do that. So number C, or letter C, the group agreed that EMS certification is important for these individuals, but it was agreed that current EMS providers would have their administrator grandfathered and would not need EMS certification, but new EMS provider applicants, so those who are currently not in the business to provide transport, would need an administrator who held some level of EMS certification. Of any of the items that you see up there, that's probably the one that caused the most discussion for a whole host of reasons, and we eventually went back to Rule 157.11, where it said and read what an EMS administrator is today. And the administrator of record today is the person named by the agency that DSHS can contact with can contact in matters related to the EMS transport provider license. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the very top dog in the organization, but it needs to have somebody that has the ability to move that agency, change that agency, and has some responsibility in that agency. So the group felt as we went forward, if we wrote these rules, that folks who are out there now, if they're not certified, that's fine. But as we go, people who are applying for new transport provider licenses, their administrator would need some level of EMS certification. Also felt that one of the other suggestions or strategies submitted by the Texas Ambulance Association was a formal compliance plan and CE related to that compliance plan. And this group felt really, as the more we went through this, that essentially what we're saying is that the administrator of record is going to, even if they're not the compliance officer in title, they're going to be the compliance officer in function with DSHS. And so the CE recommended for that would potentially also carry over here, but there was a need for CE. There was also agreement on the need of an administrator course. We talked a long time about this and basically laid down some markers in the sand as to some of the big ideas that we felt that this administrator course needed to have. For new provider license applicants, so those who want to get in the business now, the group felt that you needed to have someone who has taken the course prior to getting their provider license. So if Eddie and I are going into business, D&E ambulance, one of us has to be an EMS administrator and have taken this course for EMS administration prior to DSHS giving us our license. We felt that there'd be a need for a variance process on that as well, and for public safety needs. This is much like the talk that many of us have had on the moratorium from CMS on Medicare licenses, is that we'd like a statewide moratorium on giving out new Medicare numbers as long as there's an exemption for a public safety need or a variance for a public safety need. So Schertz EMS goes out of business, we're no longer going to do it, and Schertz Fire Department has to be licensed as the transport provider. There's got to be a way to get them licensed as a transport provider because they need it for the public safety and the needs of the community, as opposed to the fourth transport agency in a community of 15,000 opening up. Is that truly a public safety need or not? Current provider licenses we felt also needed to get their administrators through the course, but would be grandfathered for up to 2 relicensing periods. So that's anywhere from 4 to 6 years, depending upon if the rule were to be forwarded and this stayed in it. That would be anywhere from 4 to 6 years based upon when you got relicensed last as a transport provider. And the grandfather date followed the agency, so that if I haven't taken the course and I leave Schertz EMS in 2 years, they don't get another 4 or 6 years to send their new administrator to the course. They have the same amount of time, so the grandfather date stays with the agency, not the person. And that would keep people from basically playing fruit basket turnover. And is that something they play at the Piggly Wiggly? But anyway, that would prevent people from playing fruit basket turnover and just skipping agency to agency and extending that deadline out further. For current providers, there was discussion of the course being offered in module format, but the course should be designed as an all-at-one-time course and should be required that new EMS provider license administrators take the course all at one time. And then the course should include all regulatory agencies that affect EMS, including but not limited to DSHS, DEA, the Department of Public Safety, OIG, FBI, CMS, the HHSC, the Labor Board, the Texas Medical Board, etc. Where it's having folks actually come in, doing it at an appropriate enough schedule where they would be willing to send their folks. The course would have to be self-sufficient so that we could afford to get those folks in and out, but to bring the actual people in. We've had some issues in our area recently with a public safety, a 911 agency's administrator who got in trouble and got a little sideways with CMS and found himself indicted on federal charges. And we were talking to the rest of our EMS leaders in our RAC about it, and we said, the CMS has it written in their law that if you know it's wrong, or if you should have known it's wrong. Well, that's a very scary statement to have written in law, but it's out there and it affects all of us that are in positions of leadership in our agencies. And so what better way to help alleviate some of that than to bring the people in who are going to be looking at you after the fact, and bring them in and let them tell you, this is what's required, this is what's nice to have, and this is what you could do if you really wanted to be stellar. Oh, by the way, this is what we're looking at on the backside to make sure that you're doing things correctly. And so it really is a compliance course is what it is, but we felt that everybody that had some way to ding us in EMS should have a seat or a time at the podium in that course to talk about their agencies, their requirements, so we hear it straight from those people, and it's not, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 12th hand information where, oh yeah, you know, you have to have those narcotics vacuum sealed and they have to be stored only in the ceiling of the ambulance in case the vehicle rolls over. And, you know, I mean, all these little old wives' tales that are out there about, that we hear about rules and regulations, that if you go and actually look at them, aren't actually there. So we felt that actually having the real people there would be great. And that there should be a CE requirement after you complete the course. There should be a CE requirement on that as well. We walked out of there with the progress we'd made so far on just that first item, and went to look at a few other things. Lon was going to look at other states to see what was out there. I'll let him talk in a sec. We wanted to review them here where we traditionally have a large crowd to get people thinking. Nothing I've went over is set in concrete. It's not even really set in silly putty yet. It's just 14 or 15 people sitting around a table saying, if we had to design this thing from scratch to do the best we could, both for the problems in our industry that's going on in our state right now, as well as to push us forward as an industry, what would we do? And how would we design it? And so that's what you see up there. We don't have, nobody has ownership on that, and we brought it here specifically for those that on the committee that weren't there with us in October, but also for everybody in this room to have a minute to come up and say, hey, that's interesting, but what about this? Or that's the worst idea I've ever heard, and this is how it's going to kill EMS, and provide us that feedback. We're on an hour and a half schedule here, so we're going to have to limit that to, as much as, or hopefully not very much, but we're going to have to limit that to some time to hit some other agenda items. But I think we're going to walk out of here with another meeting date before we get together again in February to work further on this with what we hear today and through the week from the conference, and to also start looking at some of those other strategies that were on that letter. And then, yeah, I think that's it. So Lon, you want to talk about, were you able to find anything out there from the other states? Anything else out there that maybe we could not have to reinvent the wheel?
I actually wasn't able to find much. I contacted the National Fire Academy because they've been teaching the management class for EMS and the advanced leadership class for years now. There's also a lot of EFO papers done on EMS. And their library is just outstanding as far as the research capability. So I sort of tasked that to them, and they reported back that as far as they know, or as far as they could find, there's really one set of people taking the lead, and it looks like it's us right now.
Oh, Lord.
And that's not what we wanted to hear, frankly. So it looks like we're going to be developing a class, Texas will, and implementing it, and there'll probably be other states following our lead. So if it's out there, they weren't able to find it.
All right. So for the folks on the committee, you've had about a month to kind of stew on what it was that we worked on, and nobody cares about that score, Brian. Oh, sorry. So I was saying the folks on the committee, we've had about a month to kind of stew on the work we did in Dallas. Those that weren't there but saw the minutes early, thoughts? Anything y'all would like to share or add based upon this before we turn it open to the audience?
I just have a question for you, Lon.
I can't hear you. You have to get really close.
I just have a question for Lon. If you said you talked to the National Fire Academy, any expressed interest in what we're doing? Perhaps they might want to kick in and be a part of that?
Yeah, their program manager, I think, would at this point. Had a little discussion with him as well, and they want to have a hand in whatever we do. So yeah, they have several people that are writing EMS papers over the next year to 2 years, and we could get them as far as research capability is concerned. So there's no shortage of EFOP graduates that were coming down the pipe for it. So yeah, research won't be a problem. If we want to, step out and look at what's going on out there, they'll make themselves available.
Anybody from the audience have any thoughts you want to share? Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I misunderstood you, my lack of hearing. On this administrator's class, are they going to have to be there in person, or is it going to be done by computer?
So, you know, one of the, we talked about doing both. The thought was for the new people, so the people that aren't in the business today, and they're going to open up a company, and they're going to start doing this from scratch. We felt that needed to be in person. But there could be, based upon the size and breadth, the committee felt, or the group that was in Dallas in our initial discussions felt that for the current providers, especially with the size and breadth that Texas is and the difficulty in traveling sometimes, and in our current economic conditions, how difficult it is to travel, that maybe that could be done in a modular format. And maybe even a modular format, so if you have 4 to 6 years to get it done with your licensing period, modular format that could be presented here at conference even. So you could come to conference 2 or 3 years in a row and get that knocked out if you were a current administrator, versus, you know, somebody wanting to get in the business, they're going to need to sit down. I think they're going to want to do it in a 40-hour week or however long it would take, so that they can get on towards getting their provider license going that much faster. But I don't think we've said it has to be in, it absolutely has to be in person, or it can't be done over the internet. I just think there's a lot of feeling by a lot of stakeholders that for the new people trying to get into the business for whatever reason, that would probably need to be an in-person class.
It's just that we all know, like in Houston, okay, we don't have any extra people running around that own several companies, right? So how are you going to be sure that you get the real thing in front of that computer?
Well, and so that's the other piece of this is where does the class come from? Is it something anybody can teach? Is there one source for it? You know, and we're in a tremendous state. We're in a state that about 49 other states are pretty jealous of right now because of how well we're doing economically. And one of the reasons that we do so well economically is that we have elected officials that, if you use the word barrier to entry, have a stroke and fall over. So anytime we try to erect these hurdles or these high jumps, and I think I heard it phrased best. Somebody said, well, you know, we're trying to just raise the hurdle that's there to get into the business now. And somebody said, it's not really a hurdle, it's more of a stripe painted on the ground. And that's why I think we're having some of the issues. And I think us as the stakeholders leading that, I think that's a key piece on the administrator course that needs to be taken into consideration as we make recommendations to GTAC, of how we envision that course as the EMS stakeholders. We need to keep that in mind, that we don't want the course to contribute to the problem we're having. We'd like it to be somewhat of a foot on the brake to the problem we're having, if at all possible. If that makes sense.
I was not trying to be ugly, Dudley. I appreciate the fact that you guys have addressed this problem, and with all of the input that you have on your committee, it's definitely a plus. Please don't take it as a negative comment.
I never would, ma'am. And believe me, this is as frustrating, and it's not. So somebody's turned on the light on the Houston kitchen, and so they're scattering all over the rest of the state. And it's although we all view it as a Houston problem because of the Houston Chronicle, it is not a Houston problem. It is a state of Texas problem, and it's only going to get worse if we, as people in the industry, do not step up and say, we got to fix this. Doc, please. Not that your voice doesn't carry, but
Sorry, Don Phillips. First off, I would tell you that
you have to get real close to that too. That's a really. You could raise it a little bit. I mean, come on, you're not that much taller than me.
Is that better?
Much better.
First off, I'm just sitting here looking through just the topic areas that I would envision, you know, just off the top of my head, because I wasn't at your meeting. And I would tell you that first off, I don't think that you can teach this in one sitting, 1 week. Frankly, I think that it's probably something that would be almost a semester worth of college to do. And I would also tell you that I really don't, personally, I don't like the 2 relicensing periods for the grandfathering. I'm thinking more like 2 years. Just not because we want to throw up roadblocks to anyone, but it's not something that's not doable. And ideally, the administrator for paid services is getting paid well for their services to that agency for the most part. Obviously, I work in a rural area. I understand that my EMS director there is not paid that much, but at the same time, the potential is there. And so I really think that they need to make a commitment to this. And so that's why I would say I would urge just 2 years, period. So that's my 2 cents worth as an individual.
Hey, Doc, let me ask you a question, because I was at the original meeting, but I haven't paid attention. I know there's a group on it in the TSEP meeting or the TSEP lecture series on Monday morning about the changes to the medical director rules, and it's on our agenda. We're going to go over those in a second. But one of the things that's addressed in there is that medical directors have to take an EMS medical director course. Do you know what time frame the Texas Medical Board's looking at for that?
I honestly don't. I haven't heard
Okay.
the final rule, and that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at and commenting on, because I have not looked at that final rule. Frankly, I'm in favor of it. I think that that's something that we need to do.
Yeah.
For the offline medical director. Online medical director is a totally different ball of wax. But for the offline medical director, because frankly, we've got similar issue with,
Yeah.
I remember Ed Rock presenting the survey where we found a certain percentage of our medical directors that died years ago. They were good, though.
They were
Nobody
good.
complained about it.
So good, we kept them on the roster. Anybody else? I saw a hand go up in the back. You're not going to talk about Peggy, Yes, sir.
Jeffrey Mincicoriel, EMS. Just a couple of comments. One is I would caution you from getting in bed with a single agency. Nothing against the fire academy, but only 30% of the EMS agencies in Texas are fire departments, so
Absolutely.
we don't want to tie it down to just one. The other is there are other courses out there that are formally going on as we speak, not Texas related. ASM put off by the AAA, the Management Training Institute through the AAA, probably covers a vast majority of this. So you may want to think about putting something in that would allow for a reciprocity for courses that covered the core curriculum.
Very good. I hadn't even thought
If
about
I may, Dudley, we actually talked about that to some degree, but you still have to have a module into it that handles Texas-specific issues.
A Texas module you put on the back once you got back. Justin, do you have something?
Well, Dudley, I just hope that when we look at this and we move forward, that we understand that we're asking for more governmental regulation. So we're fixing to start increasing the amount of regulatory oversight that already exists. And we've seen through example of what's going on in Houston, they're short-staffed. They have a hard time policing it as it is. So when we move forward, I hope we're able to look at that and at least get their input to it as well, because we can sit here and come up with the greatest new widget that's ever to be invented, and if we don't have ownership with the regulatory agency that's going to govern this, we've wasted our time. I'm sorry. We see where we failed now. So if we move forward, let's make sure that we get it right as we go.
Sorry. 7-0 Aggies, by the way. No, I wholeheartedly agree. There's efforts afoot to try to get them more dollars. Part of that, part of those recommendations made by the TAA was a post-licensing inspection within an unannounced post-licensing inspection within 6 months of opening business for new provider license. And DSHS just pulled a number out and said, this much money, 6 more people, we might be able to do it. And so there's a push on to see if we can get DSHS regulatory that much more money for that more people so they can try to do it. So we absolutely have to have the relationship with our regulatory agencies. It's weird because I think just about everybody in here, although we don't like it when they come to our door, we're all kind of asking for more police. It's weird that we're asking for more regulatory, but we really are. And I think that most of us in here don't mind it when they come to our door, if they're well trained and they understand what it is they're doing. And we really don't have that issue, but that more policing also affects those who are trying to hide from them as well and don't want to see them come to their door. So it's going to, no matter what we do to change the regulatory picture to try to decrease the number of providers who have decided to do things inappropriately, it's going to affect those of us who are working hard every day to do it right. There's just no way we can get away from that.
No, I agree. I just don't want to be in a situation that we regulate ourselves out of a business,
No, I agree.
because we could do that very easily, especially in the rural and frontier areas.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Kay Vogel from South Texas Health System in the Valley of Rio Grande Valley. Just ask that as you're putting your course together and looking at it, to please remember to keep in mind the hospital regulations as it pertains to EMS, and the regulations that we have with trauma designation, with stroke designations, and what those requirements are of how we have to, as a hospital, how you fit into those pieces. So including those requirements, policy requirements such as transfer requirements and things like that. Just kind of include those things in your course.
Thank you very much, man. That's actually a good point, because it's not just 15711 that affects us, you know, so.
We actually did talk a little bit about that. We mentioned make sure that we cover the acts and that type of thing as well. How we fit into things like the response for hurricanes, other disasters, so the MOUs. There's a lot to talk about in this class. I agree it's going to be a tight 40 hours.
Anybody else? Kind of as a, I mean, if you want to raise hands, are we on the right track here? Does anybody think, oh my God, what are they doing? This needs to stop today? Are we on the right track? How about that? Raise your hand. A few hands? Okay. Anybody think we are just totally messed up in the head and we need to stop sitting so close to the x-ray machine when we go to the hospital?
As it relates to this point.
Oh, as it relates to this topic, thank you. Yeah, Brian just asked a good question. Is there anybody out there with any other ideas? Anything you could think of that could help us address that? Address the overall problem of trying to create, not barriers to entry, I would say protections of public safety in an environment where we are trying hard not to create barriers to entry in the business world. All right, yes, sir. Come on up to the mic if you would, because we're live on the internet, so.
I like.
You have to get right on that mic too, sorry.
My name's Jorge Reese. I believe it's not that we're trying to create a barrier, but you gotta also think that everything that the provider does affects the patient. So I think doing this is gonna help out the patient a lot more.
Good point. Thank you, sir. All righty, when we get to the end of our meeting, we're going to set a date for our next meeting in between time. And we'll set a date and then we'll announce the date and place. Those are open. I know it's tough in today's environment for people to get to meetings in between the quarterly GTAC. But the more heads we have around the table trying to sort this out, and it's not the committee at the front and everybody in the audience. I mean, it's a big round table. Everybody's there. We're just throwing stuff out and seeing what sticks. And so the more people we have around that table, the better the preliminary piece will be when we bring it back for everybody to look at. So please, if you can at all, we'll give enough warning. It'll probably be in January, I would imagine, because unless anybody, I mean, I don't have any appointments on the 25th of December, by the way. I don't know. It's weird. My calendar's wide open that day. But with the holidays coming up, it's kind of tough. So it'll probably be in January. We'll pick a place that you can get into and out of rather easily, even if you have to take the Texas taxi there. Ozona. The Southwest flight of Ozona? Yes. Close.
I'm trying to Google that right now. I don't even know where Ozona is.
But we really do want some participation. So as you see that come out, we'll try to give a lot of notice and try to put it on your calendar and try to make it to that meeting if you can.
Dudley,
Yes, sir.
we also anticipate that this will not only affect ground providers, it will affect the air providers as well.
What now?
It'll not only affect the ground providers, but it will affect the air providers and their administrators too.
I don't know how much. Is 13 standalone or is 13 on top of 11 in 157? They work together. So yeah, it probably would. I guess I'll be hanging around after this meeting to talk to the next committee. I bet those of you that are in here for the next meeting probably already are penning and texting back and forth about that. That's actually a very good point, though, and we'll we need to get those guys involved too. Thanks. That was for the Piggly Wiggly comment right there. You're welcome. Anything else from anybody on that? All righty. Next thing we have on our agenda is to discuss the GTAC strategic plan options regarding meeting times and links as presented at the August 2012 GTAC meeting. Anybody have anything for that here? I'd like to, Cardiac went around the room this morning and just kind of got the opinion of everybody on their committee on those two plans. And I know a lot of you answered the survey that I threw out there. So I'll take the pleasure of the group. Do you want to go around the table and just give thoughts, or does anybody have anything you want to say about that, the proposed schedules?
Publicly.
Oh, come on.
Not that I'm putting my name on it.
Not that I'm putting, great. It's like a staff meeting at my EMS agency. You go out around the smoking post and everybody's got something to say. They come in the meeting and it's like crickets.
I'll say one thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Go, Lucille.
Tammy's next.
Excuse me. I'm very concerned about the two options that were given. I think the meeting times are extremely short for most of the committees. For some of them, they work well. Some of them, even a shorter period would work. I'm very concerned about the overlap. Many of us make multiple meetings, and it depends on what your pleasure is, whether that overlap's going to affect you or not. I think it's going to affect the time for stakeholder comment. Yes, a lot of the committees are meeting outside the committees at places, you know, we met in Dallas last month. But can you make these meetings and then all of those other outside meetings too and have to travel even more? I'm very concerned about the two options.
Tammy, do you have something?
My bigger concern, particularly with the one where it has them, the shorter time period with the 50 minutes, is that it would require more meetings outside of the GTAC meetings, which means more travel expense, more time away from work, essentially, or you just don't get to participate, one of the two. And then, of course, with the overlap, you end up missing part of what's said. And, you know, for some of the different topics that go on, it can have a huge impact on your agency, and you want the opportunity to speak up about those things.
Dudley, I just hope that when they make the decision and ultimately it's theirs, I hope they take number one, stakeholder input, because I was told that they closed the mic down for no stakeholder input when they presented it. And number two, as long as they're identifying the mission of what GTAC is and what its purpose is and they're achieving that, I'm fine with it. But I really don't think by the process they went through, they hit that one on the head.
Also, GTAC has a pretty long history of governing by consensus, and it seems to be a departure from that. And that's concerning. It's going to be very hard to catch everything we want to get out of meetings from that time forward, especially when you have concurrent meetings running. We're just not going to be able to do it. We looked at the schedule, we thought about, we actually took every one of us and said, well, okay, well, I'd have to be here and there at the same time, and then plus there's other things we're here for. It's just too much to do. We just, some of us can multitask, but that's a little beyond our grasp.
All right, anybody else on the committee? Yes, sir?
No, I'd just like to
Get a little
voice my
closer.
opinion also on the staggered meetings. I attend a lot of the other meetings, and to try and catch those in between, that'll be hard.
All righty. Thank you, sir. Tony, where to your part, the EMSC update.
All right, I'm going to keep it really brief. You asked me to also talk about the next item there, the recommendations on safe transport. So as far as our update, really most of what I really want to talk about, I want to bring to the committee at the next committee meeting, and so I'll be asking for space on the agenda specifically to talk about our evidence-based protocol summaries, and we've been kind of waiting for the current targeted issues grant and the research that's going on there, so that we can get our evidence-based protocols that have been written for that program included, and we really want to do that all at once. But at the same time, we also are going to be asking for the EMS committee to look at those and the medical directors committee to look at those. And, you know, ideally, when we put a resource up there, we would like to have the approval or endorsement of those groups. So we'll be talking about that at the next meeting.
Okay. Also, as you're going through that process, if you would like, a while back before you came on the committee, Brian stepped up to volunteer, and I think Lucille did too, in that protocol development and online med control stuff. So if you'd like to use them, you know, and email them stuff and run it by them and get their thoughts, please feel free, because they were interested in it and wanted to be a part of that development process to bring it back here. Now that we have you here, of course, you know, you're going to take the lead on that, but don't hesitate to use Lucille or Brian. They're both down in your neck of the woods. They have great email accounts. They respond rapidly, so feel free to utilize them in that process too if you'd like, because they stepped up for that a couple of years ago.
Wonderful. I'll certainly make use of them.
Just one additional thought on that. Many of us are going to be redoing our programs this year with relicensure for our system. And so that's usually when we start looking at our protocols, make any adjustments. How's that going to fit with your timeline? Or when can we start seeing some of this?
I've got, you know, our evidence-based summaries that we did over the last year or so, they're ready and prepared. They just really haven't been vetted through these groups yet. And I did send them out to all the medical directors, and you know, I never heard anything, you know, any kind of responses back from them. You know, they're going to be freely accessible to anybody that wants them. Right now, we're waiting to post them on the internet as a resource until we actually get them vetted.
Right, and that's my point. I think we need to make them available, because those are slow wheels to turn, and with all of us coming up in the near future, at least half of us, I think, in the state are going to be recertifying our services. Right. It would be nice to get that, start meeting with our MDs, make sure that we're in gear to make any changes we want to do.
Absolutely. All right. We will take that into consideration. Incidentally, you know, along the lines of evidence-based protocols and summaries and implementation plans, you know, Dr. Shaw's TI grant has really kind of taken a lead in implementing evidence-based protocols here in Texas, and now through NASIMSO and NHTSA, they're fixing to embark on a national study to do the same thing. And so it's kind of exciting that the work that we've done here, and certainly with the stakeholders' input, is being looked at from everybody across the country, and they're looking to our model to implement other places now. So kind of interesting little tidbit. Otherwise, we'll go on to talking about the working group best practice recommendations for the safe transport of children in ground ambulance.
You have to get right on top of it, Tom.
Okay.
There you go.
The recommendations for safe transport of children in emergency ground ambulances, published by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The drafts have been out there for the last couple of years. They really kind of lingered for a long time, but they have finally been published as the recommendations. And so input that we got from stakeholders here in Texas and other places around the country went into that, and you know, we did finally get those recommendations out there. If you have not seen them, I see on the agenda here, Dudley put a link to NHTSA's website. You can also find those on our Texas EMSC website. You can Google Texas EMSC, it comes right up. But this is really the first document we've had to provide good, sound recommendations for safe transport of children in ambulances. It's also kind of interesting that, you know, they went to great extremes to make sure that this wasn't something that could not be, you know, implemented easily across the country. It's practical. It is very heavily stakeholder based, and so you know, as you look through these set of scenarios, and let me see if I can dig that up here.
Starting on 13.
I know it's here, it's on 13.
Yep.
There we go. It provides a set of scenarios, so it's giving you recommendations for how to transport kids in any number of situations, because some of our kids are critical and some of our kids are basically just needing a ride, right? And so they may have different needs, and so the recommendations are different based on that. And so situation one is the child who is uninjured or not ill, and that even includes those that are accompanying their parents, who maybe are accompanying whatever caregiver they're with. Situation two is a child who is ill but whose condition does not require continuous and or intensive medical monitoring or interventions. Situation three is a child whose condition requires continuous or invasive monitoring or intervention. Situation four is those who require spinal immobilization or lying flat for whatever reason. And then finally, number five, children who require transport as part of multiple patient transport. So they tried to be fairly comprehensive and cover all the bases there. And then there are several recommendations underneath those. And they start out, of course, with, what's ideal? What is the best case scenario based on the best evidence we have, which, by the way, is still pretty limited because our reporting systems have really been very lacking in giving us any kind of data on injuries sustained in ambulance accidents for children or for anybody else for that matter. But I'm not going to go through this obviously, but it's just a very common sense set of guidelines, I think. And so we wanted to find out early on, before these were actually official recommendations, while they were still in draft, one of our fellows, Dr. Rashida Woods, she's no longer here, but while she was in fellowship, she did a study of Texas EMS agencies. Didn't get a fantastic return rate, but what she did find out, I think, is valuable for a preliminary study. And really what she's looking for is, what are the barriers? What are your thoughts? What do you know about this program? And so with the sample size limitations that we had, some of the things that we did find out were that, obviously they were in draft. Only about 35% of the folks out there were aware of these recommendations, and as part of that survey, she actually included the recommendations so that it would also raise awareness at the same time. Of the people that responded to the survey, 41% of the agencies, after having seen this, stated that they plan to implement the recommendations, while 60%, 58.9%, were still unsure whether they would proceed with implementation or not. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, obviously. Of those that plan to implement the recommendations, 61% plan to fully implement the recommendations. So, there was some interest out there that was raised. And as far as the barriers go, there was really no surprise. The barriers are, what's it going to cost? And we're going to have to buy equipment. And then obviously they're concerned with any new recommendations, and especially if it comes with new equipment, requires new training, and again that's a cost factor as well. So those are areas that we're certainly going to look at a little bit closer to see how we can help with some of that. Incidentally, when the recommendations were still in draft form and we put the survey out, 6.7% of the folks out there would have rated as ideal. In other words, they already had things in place so that they would fall into that ideal transportation category in almost everything. However, after listening to stakeholder input, much of it which came from here in Texas through this survey and other mechanisms, the final draft came out and made some changes based on that input, and and in the final analysis, it's going to make a huge difference in what agencies already have in place, so that now about 50% of the agencies, of those that responded to our survey, would be prepared to transport children in that ideal state. So we felt very good about where we're at already. So I think they're certainly a good set of recommendations to look at, to take and use in your agency, and to or certainly adapt to your agency. And they are the only things out there. So.
Any questions for Tony on any of those? Any questions or comments from the audience on either of those recommendations for transport of children or his EMSC project or update? All righty. I think it's worthwhile. We put that on the agenda because they came out, but I think it's good timing with them coming out. And we had a chance to discuss them, 24 hours before the exhibit hall opens. It's always wise to go into the exhibit hall with as much education as you can possibly have, because everybody over there has something to sell you. And it's always interesting when you start asking questions, like how does this fit into the NHTSA recommendations for the safe transport of children, when you see some new method of securing a child to a stretcher or to a captain's chair, a new captain's chair model, that kind of thing. Has the seat been crash tested, and those kind of things like that. A lot of people know that's kind of a passion of mine, but it's because it's critically needed. And a lot of times we just go charging off into the dark, like we have so often in our industry, just totally uneducated, and we spend a bunch of money, and then we start sitting around looking, and we're like, man, this probably wasn't the best way to have done this. So the more items that are out there, and the better educated we make ourselves. And they're available. If you go to our agenda on the GTAC website, you can click on that link, or as Tony said, you can go to the Texas EMSC Project's website, and they have the link there as well. It looks like a bad lengthy document. It's about 43 or 44 pages long. But if you start on page 13 where the recommendations are very easy to work your way through and to kind of evaluate how your agency is doing it currently, and to see maybe if you need to make some operational changes. So it's a good tool to have. And if you have any questions, you can certainly see Tony. He'd try to steer you towards some right resources. He has all the connections as far as who it was that was behind this and put it together. I'd be happy to talk to you, as I know just about anybody else would, about that. But it's just an important document. They finally came out with something with some good recommendations, and then tied to this, of course, is the NFPA recommendations that are now out as well. So some people are trying to help us make ourselves safer despite our best efforts, and we probably need to start trying to pay attention to that. Yes, sir.
What was the role of EMSC with this, or was there?
EMSC, if you get back to the back of this, somewhere in here, it talks about who all had a role in this. Certainly, EMSC was one of the folks. They may have put it somewhere else now, but it may be up front now. But EMSC was one of the organizations on the national level that sat at the table. Here it is on page 5, it looks like, as part of the working group. And EMSC is also obviously had a lot of input from, earlier they had a set of recommendations, if you want to call them that. They were basically a list of do's and don'ts. They couldn't really qualify as recommendations, but they've been working on this for a number of years, and all that is explained in detail in this, in the first part of this set of recommendations, the EMSC's role and everybody else's role, and kind of how it got to where it is today.
Right. I thought it was interesting that on page 11, on those bullet points under operational, we always seem to focus on the things that cost a lot and what's going to cost me out of this document. The last bullet point on there is probably the most significant. methods to reduce the unnecessary use of emergency lights and sirens when transporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I've been preaching that for quite some time. We tend to turn our lights and sirens on because we can, not necessarily because it's the best thing to do.
Well, and when you read through the fine print of this, it looks like they used 2010 data to make most of these recommendations, and then only 2 kids were injured out of those FARS reportings that were reported, and none of them were in the ambulance. They were in other vehicles that we hit in the intersection.
Right.
So,
it also, you know, it does talk a lot about the fact that there's just not good data out there.
Right.
So we really don't know. So a lot of this is based on engineering reports. A lot of it is based on practical, you know, common sense. But there's not a lot based on data. And so as data does come in, these things are likely to change, obviously.
well, and it's kind of like a second opinion too, though. I think if you look at NFPA, you look at all these people making recommendations right now, the one underlying thing is that last bullet point.
Right.
There's not a lot of data on anything except we hit people when we run lights and sirens.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
I think that retrospective study done by Dr. Levick from 97 to 2002, they went back in 2004 and looked at as much data from all the states as they could find. 70% of fatal ambulance accidents occurred with the lights and sirens operating. 83% of the fatalities in ambulance accidents are in the back of the vehicle to improperly or unrestrained occupants. So that's us and kids in mother's arms and that kind of thing like that. So
I did think it was interesting on page 16 where they made the hint of the forward-facing EMS provider seat for the child restraint. Yep. Certainly a good point.
Now there is, you know, this ties in, like you said, well with the NFPA recommendations and things like that. There was an interesting discussion at NASIMSO about the NFPA regulations and the triple K specs and all of that. And so there's still a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of things up in the air that are certainly going to affect these in the long run. So, you know, obviously, like any set of recommendations, they're going to be, you know, changed and altered. But what I really appreciated more than anything else out of this is that they really made an effort to keep it as common sense and implementable as possible, in, you know, leaving people, you know, plenty of options to use the resources that they have available. More than anything else, it's an education issue, right? I mean, we had a discussion just a few minutes ago, how many of you have carried your babies in mom's arm on the stretcher, right? Mm-hmm. Rarely ever a problem, but you know what? If that ambulance hits something on the way, that kid's going to be, you know, pop out of those arms like a grape, and you know, we don't think about it. And so, so there's not a lot of data. There's not a lot of times that that's happened, but I don't want to be the one that it happens to, right? And so now that there's recommendations here, not only do we, you know, are we educating people a little bit more, which I think is probably the best thing that will come out of this is some education and some recognition. But at the same time, I think it also raises just a little bit that liability, because, hey, there's a set of recommendations now. Why in the world weren't you following them? Right. You know, why isn't the kid in that seat still strapped in to the cot, which is still there, instead of laying out in the street? You know, that's going to be a good question the lawyer's going to have now that these are out. You know? So you really do need to think about that.
all righty. Anything from the audience on that safe transport of children? I do have one very important update. 21-0 Aggies. Thank you very much.
20.
Oh, I got 21, so maybe somebody saw it before. Maybe that score hadn't updated from the extra point. Don't worry, it's not the second half yet. I'm not getting that excited. Next on our agenda is, Jane, any update on the 157 or the 157 rules and their progress through the churn?
We're brain dead, but that's about it. We're still working through the process, and we are still pushing to have a draft done somewhere in the middle of January. And that's about it, Dudley.
Okay, cool. Next is the update on the work group of air medical and ground providers looking at the, and medical director looking at examining the language in 157.11 and 157.13 regarding patient care issues when EMS and ground and air providers are present. Berta, thank you very much for being here. You're going to need to get a little closer. It's as close as you pretend you're Justin Bieber or something. Just get right up there on it like that.
It must be off, Bert.
Oh, maybe off. There you go.
Here, use this one. Use this one.
You can turn and look at them. Or did it go dead? Oh, okay. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. We're going to meet tomorrow at 2:30. We're going to take the pediatric time slot and hopefully have everything finalized so that we can get this mailed off or emailed out.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. And then number 7, the Texas Medical Board Administrative Code Rules, Title 22, Chapter 197, Emergency Medical Services regarding EMS medical directors. They are recommending some pretty decent rule changes. A lot of this is after some better working together efforts between DSHS and the Texas Medical Board. We got those up on the screen. I'm going to walk through a few of these because I think for a number of you they may cause some concern. These are due to be discussed, I think, at their meeting at the end of November. Is that correct, Dr. Phillips?
It's already in the Texas Register.
Okay. So, and their next meeting is the last one in November, so I bet that if it's in the register now, that's probably when they're talking about it. They did input of medical directors, and as the chair of this committee, I was invited to that meeting and got to provide some input. And it's been out there. A lot of groups have made some public comment on it, and I'm sure they'll have that opportunity to do more of that between now and their meeting near the end of November. But these are important to kind of look through because they are going to put some additional requirements on your medical director, and I guess probably by the transitive property on us as EMS providers. So some of the new changes implement and ensure all EMS personnel follow protocols that prohibit the back signing of transfer orders. And I think part of that also has to do with the back signing of protocols. That was an issue that's come up when during some increased efforts in some of our larger metropolitan areas, they found agencies that were running without medical directors, and other agencies who were trying to run without a medical director went and got one and then had them back sign the protocols. That's now going to become a problem for the physician's license and not just the EMS transport provider. Notify the board at any time of license or registration of this title, anytime they are a medical director, in the name of all EMS providers for whom that physician holds the position of offline medical director. They have to complete the following educational requirements under these proposed rules within 2 years, either before or after initial notification to the board of holding the position as an offline medical director. They have to do 12 hours of formal CME as defined under their chapter. They have to have board certification in emergency medical services by the Board of Specialty, or a DSHS approved medical director's course, any of those. And then every 2 years for their relicensing, they're going to have to turn in 1 hour of formal CME in emergency medical services. A physician may not hold the position of offline medical director for more than 20 EMS providers unless the physician obtains a waiver under subsection D, or for any EMS provider if the physician has been removed for cause by any governmental agency. So if somebody gets their ticket pulled or they're told you can't be a medical director, they can't go sell their services to another agency. D, the board may grant a waiver to allow a physician to serve as offline medical director for more than 20 EMS providers if the physician provides evidence that the Department of State Health Services has reviewed the waiver request and has determined that the waiver is in the best interest of the public. The physician is in compliance with this chapter by submitting documentation of protocols and standing orders, and appropriate safeguards exist for patient care and adequate supervision of all EMS personnel and the physician's supervision. So essentially all of that about the number of agencies was written to stop some of the egregious things going on in Houston. I think it was 60 or 70 agencies one guy was on record of being medical director for. The Texas Medical Board believes there's no way they can properly oversight those care providers. So they wanted a number. That number went back and forth, and I know up in the Panhandle in those regional systems, the medical directors are medical director for 30 or 35 agencies, and that was the reason for the waiver process. There are places in our state where medical directors, for whatever reason, are over a large number of agencies, but it's being done correctly. The infrastructure's in place, the review of calls, the interface with the care providers is all being done appropriately, and that's not the issue. The issue is the $3,000 a month and I'll sign your ticket type of issue. So that is, they wanted to not undo the work that has been done in some areas of the state to have a regional practice of EMS, and it's being done well and it's being done successfully, versus places where it's we got to get this signed so we can start moving people to dialysis. So any issues with that? Anything on there from our committee standpoint or the audience's perspective on these proposed rules? As I said, these are on the medical director's meeting for the August meeting. If you have not shown these to your medical director, please do that quickly, because they may want to make some comments to the Texas Medical Board. Last thing you want is for these to come out, your medical director get a letter and come to you saying, hey, why do we got to do this? So I can.
And this is posted on the registry?
Yes, it's in the Texas Registry, or the Texas Register, pardon me. And they're out on the Texas Medical Board website. If you go to their upcoming or proposed rules, it's listed there as well. And then they're in the meeting documents for the August GTAC session, August of 2012, medical director's documents. That's who has all this stuff highlighted. The yellow and green's all from the medical director's committee. All right. This time we'll open the floor for some general public comment. Anybody got anything you want to say? Come on now. We talked about some good stuff. Come on. Okay.
The exhibit hall doesn't open until tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. But they're all just standing and sitting out there. You know what they're doing? They're watching the game. That's what they're doing. For the committee's benefit, so you know, I spoke with the medical directors and I talked to the chair of the education committee. We stumbled across something in our system. We have eight first responders underneath our transport provider license. We have the same medical director, same protocols. We're just tied together as an EMS system. And we had one of our smaller departments, we just kind of stumbled across it, had gotten a CE number for teaching CE on their own. And so that caused our medical director a little bit of concern. We started looking into it, and the medical director doesn't have to have any input in teaching CE. You can't do much anything else in EMS without the medical director's input, but you can teach CE without that. And so I brought it up to the medical directors who had some questions. I brought it up to Jody with the education committee. He said he'd bring it up in February on their agenda to start looking at maybe if we can't recommend some type of medical oversight to those CE processes. It just doesn't make a lot of sense that you can't get your initial certification without a medical director. You can't operate without a medical director, but you can teach anything you want and get it approved as approved DSHS CE without a medical director. It just doesn't, I don't know, it just didn't make sense to me. So I brought that up to them. If you hear any of that talk going around, it was all because of me. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and for everybody in the room, Maxie sent out a letter. I think he sent out an email. Hopefully you've been contacted by your EMTF, your Emergency Medical Task Force leader, or your RAC to explain that the way we do the ambulance MOU is changing in Texas. It's the end of December when the current ones become invalid, right?
We're planning to mail the letters as soon as I can get finished with the conference.
Okay.
You'll be getting those letters soon.
And the target date's still December 31, though, that those will be over?
Probably more like March. I think
okay.
Give you 6 months.
Okay. So sometime in the next 5 to 6 months, our current MOUs with DSHS will become null and void because we're pushing everything down to the EMTF level. And for those of you that remember all those days of, we used to always ask, wouldn't it make more sense to do the prayer chain where Maxie calls 4 or 5 people and they call 4 or 5 people, and instead of Maxie calling 220 of us and making his finger numb and he can't hear anything out of that one ear anymore. So that is happening through the EMTF process. The MOUs are going to go to that level as well, and so if you're concerned in any way about that, please get with your emergency medical task force leaders. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Eric Epley would too. He was going to try to make it here. I don't know if he made it in. Maxie would be happy to talk to you about why we're doing this. But for the same reason it makes a lot of sense to launch and coordinate those things at the local and regional level, it makes a lot of sense to hold that MOU at that same level as well. It doesn't change anything in the timeline, and so you're going to have to work with your EMTFs. They'll explain to you their own processes. But the MOU is pretty much a uniform MOU, even across the EMTFs. It may have a comma or a period or a semicolon that's a little bit different based upon each EMTF. But for the most part, we tried to maintain uniformity and get that down to a little bit smaller scale. So if you have not been contacted by your EMTF or your RAC, get a hold of them and ask them where that MOU is and start working on your processes for getting that signed so that we don't have a lapse. The last few times we've had the potential for deployment, the EMTF model has been used for that, and we have rostered more ambulances both of those times than we ever did with the phone call and trying to get people together. So it appears that it's going to work well, but we have to make sure that everybody's aware that that MOU is not going away. It's just moving to a different level in our structure as an emergency management in our emergency management structure. So it's just coming down from the state level to the regional level, but it's going to be basically the same document. It's going to, I don't even know if the rates have changed, but it's basically the same document. Timelines are the same, so we need to get that signed with your EMTF as soon as we can. Any questions about any of that from anybody in the room? Anybody seen that or wondering or said, what the heck's going on? Why'd Maxie tell me I'm not going to be able to go to disasters anymore? Okay, good. Good. And then I think Jane had something she wanted to share with us.
Thanks, Dudley. The Trauma Systems Committee is putting together a work group. The work group is the Trauma Systems Committee Registry Work Group. And Jory talked about this at her last committee meeting in August and brought it to the council for their information. But it's been solidified a little more, and Dudley, if you have not received this communication from Jory, you probably will in the next week or so. This work group, we are asking that each committee of GTAC select a representative to sit on this work group. Now, the purpose of the work group, again, they will be working with DSHS, the registry staff, and short-term goals are to foster open communication during the implementation phases with the new state registry, promote initiatives that assist in that implementation, and provide the state registry with feedback regarding desirable enhancements to the new registry. This group will serve as the information conduit back to their constituents and stakeholder groups regarding the status of that registry. There are 18 seats on this work group, one from each of the 10 committees of GTAC, one from TTAF, one from TTCF, a couple of at-large members, and 2 staff from DSHS. Because we're asking the committees to select a representative, you'll need to have this on your agenda for a formal meeting. So whenever your next agenda, your next meeting is going to be, Dudley, I ask that you put this on there so that y'all can be thinking about it between now and your next meeting, and then you can discuss it and make a selection. Okay, I think Jory would like to have the first meeting of this work group sometime around the February GTAC meetings. So if you could kind of have that timeline. Some committees do not have interim meetings, so they may not actually get to this agenda item until their February meeting, but you'll be hearing more from her about that. Okay, questions?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Eddie, you're lucky. We can't act on it today because Justin already nominated you for that. So. Yes, seriously, if anybody's interested in that, let me know. And we'll put that on our agenda for our interim meeting between now and our February meeting so we can get that officially named for Jory. That's kind of an important deal to be able to use that registry appropriately, and it's not just a bunch of stuff we're dumping in a big pit somewhere. So hopefully we can get that back. Oh. Eric's here. Does anybody have any questions about the EMTF or the MOU? If you don't like it, it's all Eric's fault. All right. We need to look at meeting dates real quick before we get out of here. We got a couple of minutes to do that. I was looking in January. Does Friday still work well for everybody in January? So the Fridays in January, the 4th, the 11th, the 18th, and the 25th. Do we know off the top of our head the February GTAC meeting date?
Yes.
27, 28, and the 1st? Okay, cool. Plenty of time then. The 11th is personally bad for me. I'll be at Mickey Mouse World that weekend, so...
How about 18th?
18th works.
The 18th? Anybody have any issues on the 18th of January?
That's when we have all our RAC meetings. And it's going to take me, Lon.
We have a meeting this coming week. We can propose to change that.
Well, I like the way Lon talks. So it's the issue with their RAC, and Brian and Lon may be unavailable, but Lon's willing to move those meetings. So I like this.
Are we considering Ozona?
Well, we do need to pick a location.
I tell you what, the Houston group will change their RAC meeting if we can move it to Houston. Little bribery.
Wow.
Any issues?
Have our RAC meeting and the GTAC meeting at the same time.
You know, we could.
So any issues with the 18th first? Anybody else have issues with the 18th other than our Houston contingent? All righty.
Dallas stands firmly behind us.
We're halfway there. Yeah,
any issues with having this meeting in Houston?
Say yes. So long as it's on record.
Well, come to me, man.
We
you
do
can ride
not
with.
have the Piggly Wigglies in Houston.
Yeah.
Just to put that on record.
Houston.
If we did the 18th in Ozona, is it still spiking?
It's okay to go to Houston in January. There's no hurricanes.
There's no snow there.
And there's no snow. True. If there is snow, we're not going. All right, let's shoot for the 18th in Houston. We'll probably start at 10 to give people time to get there. And then Lon and Brian, if y'all can secure us a meeting location and get that to me as quick as you can so I can get that to DSHS and they can get the formal meeting approval done. If y'all want to pencil that in and try to be there, please do. We're going to tear back into these strategies for reducing fraud, so we would like as many of you there to help with that as we possibly can. January 18th, starting at 10 in the morning, and we'll put out the location in Houston where that is.
But we will meet in Ozona one time next year.
We've got to meet in Ozona sometime. That may not be an official meeting. Maybe we'll have to meet there in shifts so we don't violate the Open Meetings Act.
Don't want to overwhelm the infrastructure.
We don't want to overwhelm the infrastructure of Ozona. All righty. Is there anything else for the good of the order? All right. Well, I'll meet everybody downstairs for the Aggie game then. We're adjourned.
Did they?